choice mechanisms. The Archdiocese of Boston did adopt it. They are in the process of implementing it. There is an enormous amount of pushback that's beginning to occur. In fact, I'd say there's probably more pushback among the Catholic school parents than there are the public school parents at this point. And the reason why is as well as Massachusetts, its public system has done, the Archdiocese adopted the previous Massachusetts standards. So they too had these best in the country standards. And as well as Massachusetts public system has done, the Archdiocese is out schools, and it's the largest school system. If you look at it as a school system, it's about 70,000 students. It outperformed Massachusetts. There's not a lot of great apples to apples comparisons. There's SAT and some other tests, but there's not great comparisons. But the few that we have in common between the Archdiocese schools in Massachusetts and the public schools, they outperform us, and they did it with the standards that Sandy developed.
Okay, so I have almost 8:15. Let's just take 5 minutes to stretch.
A little bit, because that was implicit in several questions. Why did these standards come about? What was the possible motivation? And I will go a little bit further than Jamie did, because what I began to sense from the very beginning by looking at who was on these committees was that there was a different agenda. It wasn't an educational agenda, even though it seemed like this was going to have an educational agenda. There was a social agenda. And the social agenda was actually more explicit in the very first draft of the text that I saw for the English Language Arts Standards document. And I could sum it up by saying social justice. That was the word, the phrase that was then taken out and never appeared in any other draft that I saw. But it's part of the idea, and I'm not panning the idea, that there was an effort to think about, number one, how to equalize academic expectations across the country, because it was true that Mississippi had lower expectations than Massachusetts, and many people were bothered by what they said were uneven academic expectations across the country. That didn't necessarily mean that you would have to bring down Massachusetts. Many people in Massachusetts meant that you would bring up Mississippi, but that isn't the way it happened. But the more pronounced kind of vision was that we would get everybody going to college. It's improving the college rate. And you will hear both the president and people in many states, like the one I worked in for 5.5 years, Arkansas, which was near the bottom in terms of the percentage of those with college degrees who live in the state, was probably next to the bottom of all the states. Massachusetts is one of the highest states with people who have post-graduate degrees or post-secondary degrees. There was an effort to get everybody thinking about going to college, and that was why these standards were called very cleverly college readiness standards, because what it did conceptually was to remove the distinction that has existed historically between a high school diploma and college admission requirements. If you call standards that are given as the basis for a test in grade 11 college readiness tests, college readiness standards, ipso facto, those who pass this test are college ready. Therefore, they go, like on a monopoly board, right to go. They can go to college, and the college has no basis for saying they should be remediated, which is, of course, one of the real problems in our community colleges. About 50% end up in remedial coursework. There's a placement test. There's a large number, or a large percentage in our public colleges as well, state colleges. But the idea was that if a student is declared college ready, they will be able to go, and that was part of the grand contract that was to be signed by the governor and the commissioner of ed and the board of ed in these states that signed on to adopt Common Core standards, that students who passed, who would go to college, could take freshman courses for credit. No remediation. We don't know yet what's going to happen with that piece of it. But the piece that had to be worked out first was the K-12 piece to get to the college readiness test, which is now in the works and will come in one more year or so, 2015. They're piloting items and developing the tests, the two testing consortia. And then there is to be a contract with higher ed officials, most of whom have no idea what's going on because the contract will be with the presidents of community colleges and colleges who do not consult their mathematics faculty, their science faculty, their engineering faculty, or their humanities faculty. They simply sign off because they are the presidents. And who is, last I read, the chair of this group to help develop this kind of agreement? The last I heard, it was the person who is head or chair of the Board of Higher Education here in Massachusetts, who comes from Northeastern University. The point being that if you want to get the bottom 30% of the population into college, into credit-bearing courses, what has to happen? Anyone can think through that if the bottom 30% is to be able to do college-level work, you must bring college-level work down. There's no other way it can happen. It's not that all kids can't learn more, which was the basis for the Massachusetts standards. Everyone can learn more. And one of the virtues of the Massachusetts standards was that all groups were improving and increasing. But there was no philosophy behind it that said everyone can be capable of earning a PhD, because this is one of the things that we know is simply something most people don't want, and that many can't handle, don't want, even if they might be interested. So if you want to get a large number, more than whatever number now, 30% who actually have BA or BS degrees in this country, if you want to equalize demographic achievement, which was the driving goal, as I say, that was the social agenda that I think was behind this ultimately, then you have to figure out what you do to lower what your expectations are for the first 2 years of college down to the high school level, and somehow boost up a little bit, because the elementary standards are stronger than the middle and high school standards in both mathematics and English. I'm not a mathematician, but from what my mathematics friends tell me, the earlier standards are stronger, even though they have their own problems in the way they handle the standard algorithms, for example. But the point is that if you want to get more students to pass a test called college readiness, which then lets them go into credit-bearing freshman courses at the college level, you've got to lower the content level by about a grade or two, and that is what this mathematician that Jamie mentioned, James Milgram from Stanford, estimated was about the level of grade 8 in Common Core's math standards, that they would put American students about 1 to 2 years behind their peers in other high-achieving countries. I can't make the same kind of precise estimate in English because it will all depend on the level of difficulty of the reading passages chosen in grades 11 and 12 for the test, and then where the cut score is. All of this has to be worked out. We're dealing with something that's in motion every day, and it's hard to pin it down because there are things happening every day as different pieces come out from this basic premise that somehow we're going to be able to get everyone to be college or career ready, as if career is equivalent to college in the demands. Now, I was also on the State Board of Education for 4 years. I was appointed by then Governor Romney, and I was let go by Governor Patrick, as you can well understand, after the vote, July 21st, 2010, when the Board of Ed, after asking almost no questions, simply voted yes to agree to adopt Common Core because, as Maura Banta told me, and I asked her, it had higher expectations. That was the basis. They couldn't analyze either the English or the math standards because most of them were not capable of reading a standards document to understand what was in it. They were no different, by the way, from most boards of education in this country. The state boards of education have been one of the major basic problems in this whole process. Many of them, like Kentucky, adopted Common Core standards before they were written. Now, what do you make of people who the governor has appointed to a state board of ed who adopt something that's going to profoundly alter the entire educational picture, every piece of your educational structure, and the standards haven't been written? I mean, there's a missing rational process that has taken place in this country that I still don't quite understand. No matter how much they may have been filled with compassion about the idea of social justice, there's a whole lot of kids in this country, and one should have reasonable expectations for all of them. But I still don't quite understand. Equal expectations was part of it. Making it easier for textbook companies, this was actually told by someone in the USDE, to be able to have only one set of sales pitch that they could make to the whole country. They wouldn't have to have 50 different sales pitches. And the technology would be the same across the country. And then they'd be easily able to deal with the country as a whole, because they could then deal with just one entity. Now, they kept saying over and over again, and this was like a parrot, a lot of parrots were out there, these standards are more rigorous than almost all those out there, because they knew that several states, including Massachusetts, had better standards than Common Core's. In fact, almost all states had better standards than Common Core. They didn't have all the strings attached to Common Core. On the surface, it would look as if Common Core standards were better, because they promised they would be fewer, leaner, clearer. This, of course, wasn't true. They weren't clearer. That's why there are so many interpretive problems right now about what these standards mean. But they were fewer, and many state superintendents across the country, including boards of ed, have said, oh, we've got smaller number of standards now. We're much better off having the Common Core standards. You don't have to test as much. Now, as one person wrote in the evaluation of the new science standards that have just come out, by the way, which are really serious business and need a lot more attention, that wasn't Common Core. Common Core was only English and math. Achieve has come out with some new science standards, but this person said that, yes, you could have one standard that subsumes so many other things that you've got a whole course that needs to be taught to get to that one standard. So just because you have few standards, it doesn't mean that you have reduced what students need to learn. It all depends what level that standard has been written at and what is included in that standard. Let me talk about what I see as some of the major issues that caused both Jim Milgram and me and 3 other people on the validation committee to refuse to sign off. We were expected to be rubber stamps. That was the issue. And anyone who knows me would know that I could never be a rubber stamp. I, by the way, was a library trustee in Brookline for 14 years and a town meeting member for 10 years, and I was never a rubber stamp for anyone. So I've learned through the kinds of political processes that we have, fortunately, in this state, how to speak up and to ask questions. And I kept asking for information and for evidence, not getting them. So I wasn't going to sign off on, neither was Jim, because these standards were not internationally benchmarked. But you will hear over and over again people who are advocates of Common Core saying they are internationally benchmarked, but they're not. And I keep saying to these people, if you think they are, find out what countries we're benchmarked to. And they can't find them. And there's no mention of these countries because there aren't any. We weren't benchmarked, period. We are non-competitive. These standards were not research-based, and Jim mentioned one thing that would be of interest to those in mathematics who know more about the high school math curriculum than I do. Apparently, Common Core has a set of geometry standards that were tried out years ago in the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, didn't work out there, have never been tried anywhere else. They're a different approach, they're non-Euclidean. And yet they're there, and most American teachers can't teach to them, and we have no basis for including them in our math sequence. There's no research base for them, but they're there. So these standards are non-rigorous, even though, as I say, there are a lot of parrots flying around saying they're more rigorous than anything else out there, which I think was the key word that sold a lot of people, and sold also many Catholic superintendents who kept hearing that the public school was going to have more rigorous standards than what they already have, so therefore they better go with Common Core. In other words, everybody was willing to, what is it, drink the Kool-Aid or buy the snake oil, whatever your favorite metaphor is, you go with. And I kept thinking to myself, didn't they have any people who knew math well enough to look at these math standards at the high school level? Didn't they have any English language experts who could see what was missing in the English language arts? And I'll get to that in a minute. So you have non-benchmarked, non-research-based, non-competitive, non-rigorous standards. Let me start by saying what were some of the strengths of the older standards. And those of you who are in the schools or teachers, particularly if you're English teachers, can stand up and disagree later if you want with it, but this is what we heard, because these kinds of standards have been in Massachusetts since basically 96, 97. They went through a slight modification in 2001, and they are now being phased out. Their main pitch was literary study at the high school level. Why? Because that is what English teachers in this state told us they wanted. That's what they've been trained for. They're trained to teach literature, not informational text. And so most of the standards that deal with reading in this document are about the four major